Our next paper is from Corinna Schlams from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Corinna is an outstanding historian with a specialty in technology, and she is going to be sharing a paper on the engagement of women in mechanics institutes.
Hello, I very much look forward to talking to you today about giving women a practical education, domestic science at Rochester Institute of Technology. At RIT today, about a third of our students, and marked in blue, identify as women. And that is very much my own experience teaching here at RIT in classes of 30 to 40 students. I often have a handful of women. So it came as an utter surprise to me, at least, when I discovered that at the turn to the 20th century, about 100 years ago, women even outnumbered men. We can see here in the number of students, the line of women caught up with the line of men, and then until the 1920s when it declined. The women at the turn to the 20th century primarily enrolled in two departments, domestic science, most of them in domestic science, and fewer of them in the art and design program. My talk today focuses on the domestic science program, which is where most of the women enrolled. And I argue that while RIT's domestic science department may have been founded with the paternalistic intention of instructing women in housekeeping skills, the women in charge of the program shaped it to provide students with a practical education that opened career opportunities and financial and social independence to them. As a historian of science and technology and a baker myself, I'm also fascinated by the many recipes that I found in the RIT archives, and so indulge me at the end of my talk. I'll show you a few of those as well. But let me begin with a brief institutional history to contextualize the domestic science department. Rochester Institute of Technology was founded in 1829 as the Rochester Athenaeum, which primarily gave access to a technical library and also to evening lectures. Met here in Corinthian Hall for about 2 decades and then languished after the Civil War. At the end of the 19th century, in 1885, a group of manufacturers took initiative to found the Mechanics Institute in an effort to provide free evening classes to the Rochester workforce. And the Mechanics Institute merged with the Athenaeum in 1891 to form the Rochester Athenaeum and Mechanics Institute, RAMI. You see here an image of the 3 of the founders, and Henry Lom on the far right is the one that we'll meet again in our talk today. I should add that while the Rochester Athenaeum was a bottom-up egalitarian, more of a bottom-up egalitarian self-help or self-improvement initiative, the Mechanics Institute has some paternalistic aspects with these manufacturers doing it for the workforce in an effort to improve the workforce. This is not unusual for this time. We can think about the many company towns that were built at this time, East Rochester, Hershey, Baca in the Czech Republic. We can also think about Henry Ford and his efforts. But it marks a change in the history of RIT and EFIX initiative. From very early on, RAMI included a domestic science department. It was founded in 1892 and started offering the first classes in 1892. Anecdotal evidence says that Lom was interested in this department because he had a general interest in health, but also that he was displeased by the quality of his workers' lunches, and that he hoped through educating their housewives he could improve the quality of these lunches. A committee of women took charge of the domestic science department under its chair, Mrs. Ezra Andrews, and Andrews was the wife of the second president of RAMI, one of Lom's co-founders of the institute. And the Women's Committee here oversaw the finances for the domestic science department. They hired teachers and they also made curricular decisions. And they were the ones who emphasized the practical orientation for the domestic science department and who also opened career opportunities for the young women taking classes. The department regularly brought in lecturers, and one of them was a very notable one, Ellen Swallow Richards. Richards was the first woman graduate of MIT. She received a BS in chemistry, and she taught classes in sanitation chemistry at MIT since the 1870s. When she taught at Rami in late 1894, she was about 5 years from organizing the so-called Lake Placid conferences that eventually culminated in the formation of the National Home Economics Association. And so Richards is really considered the founder of home economics in the United States. Richards herself emphasized a theoretical or scientific orientation for the field, teaching sanitation chemistry, knowledge about sanitation rather than practices of sanitation. In contrast to Richards' theoretical orientation, the Women's Committee at Rami emphasized practical orientation. So the classes that they were offering were cooking classes, sewing classes, classes in emergency aid, classes in invalid nursing, for example, invalid cooking. The practical orientation is also clear in the floor plan for the domestic science department in the new Eastman building that Rami moved into in 1901. And I know that the writing here is too small, and so I marked all the classrooms that serve practical teaching. So on the second level, all of these are the rooms for sewing classes. On the first level, these are the rooms for cooking classes, and they take up a much larger footprint than the few classes here marked in red that are lab classes or lab spaces or classrooms for more theoretical instruction. In addition, the domestic science department kept a practice house, a so-called practice house. This was the house where the initial classes had been held before the construction of the Eastman building, and it was refurbished so that students could live in the practice house for 6 weeks and practice keeping house with a tutor. So very much in line with the co-op program that was founded at RIT around the same time. This practical orientation was in line with Lam's interest in educating housewives, but the steering committee certainly went a step further. They did not just teach these women to become more effective housewives. They very soon began to open programs that would prepare these women for independent careers. One of them was a normal course, teacher training, that was started within 5 years of the first class being offered. Teaching, of course, was seen as a nurturing profession and therefore appropriate for young women. But offering teacher training in domestic science was unique. Actually, Rami became one of only 3 institutions in the Northeast to offer teacher training in domestic science. The others were Pratt in New York and Drexel in Philadelphia. And Andrews very much recognized that they needed to create a demand for these new teachers, particularly because domestic science or home economics was not yet integrated into the school curriculum. But teacher training fit very well with the practical orientation, because as primary or secondary teachers, of course, these women would then educate young girls to become more effective housekeepers and to learn to cook, to learn to sew, for example. Over the next decade, the domestic science department added other programs that also prepared young women for careers. For example, the kitchen administration program that prepared them for careers in large kitchens in hospitals and cafeterias or in nursing homes. And the department, it seems, merged into this by taking charge of the lunchroom in the basement of the New Eastman building. And here the women started cooking larger portions for larger groups, and also started cooking on larger different equipment. This career orientation clearly went beyond Lam's intentions for the program. Actually, there's evidence that Lam pushed for the domestic science department to, in the early years in particular, to offer classes to public school students to educate these women, these young girls, really, to become more effective housekeepers. And so in the early years, when the domestic science department had more courses than students, they did actually offer these kinds of classes, for example, to students from the city high school, but also from other public schools. But there was really, you can see a push and pull between the Women's Steering Committee and Lam, and the women emphasized that offering these kinds of classes for a cost basis limit the department growth opportunities and profit opportunities, and also started to hinder regular students from pursuing their course of study. What they did not say was that these courses would not prepare women for independent careers, but I think that was a subtle implicit subtext to this debate between Lam and the steering committee. So now very briefly to my recipes. Here I have a recipe from the very early days of Rami cooking, from a cooking demonstration in 1893. See here, winter wheat flour. That's not the kind of industrial flour that I buy at the grocery store today. Bake in a moderate oven. That's not an instruction that I can follow because it clearly assumes that this is a wood-fired stove where I cannot regulate the temperature to a precise temperature. I also don't get a baking length, for example. We found a scrapbook with instructions for public schools, recipes for public school instructions, and then most of the recipes are actually these card catalogs. This one is one that was recently found by one of the staff assistants in my college in the kitchen cabinet of a local church, and I'm fascinated by it because it has this category, temperature and measurements, with conversions for scaling up recipes, but also temperature conversions between Fahrenheit and Celsius that indicate that by this time there's the idea that these kitchen administrators will cook on gas stoves or electric stoves that allow for exact temperature regulation. So to conclude, clearly, Rami's domestic science department provided practical education to women in skills like cooking and sewing and helped them become more effective homemakers. But in addition to that, it also opened careers from teaching to kitchen management, which provided an opportunity for financial and social independence. The young women became an integral part of Rami's daily life. They were present in the lunchroom, in the library. They participated enthusiastically in many fundraising activities, and they were central to the public perception of Rami, for example, through annual exhibits or public entertainment and education programs. In the context of this conference, the story of Rami's domestic science department and the women student raises two questions for me. First, about the history of women's education at the Mechanics Institute. I now know a little bit more about RIT's own history in that respect, but I wonder in how far RIT's history is unique or common for mechanics institutes, maybe in the United States or North America, maybe also in the European context and elsewhere. And I wonder if women studied at other mechanics institutes as well, in which disciplines they studied and whether their studies open career opportunities for them. The second set of questions revolves around the fantastic legacy that this program offers. clearly these women were attracted to the kind of practical institution, the education that Rami offered and that our institution still offer today. And I find this in my own institution, in my own students. In my history classes, I often bring technical objects like this radio model, and women and minority students seem to respond very enthusiastically to these discussions that start from very concrete objects, practically based discussions. And so we have women and minority students that come to us with these interests. And I wonder about the legacy where we today can push the boundaries similar to the way that the steering committee pushed professional boundaries for the women at the time. Back then, opening career opportunities and wondering what boundaries we can push today for our students. Thank you so much. Thank you particularly to Liz, the RIT activist, for opening the archives to me, although a construction project affects the library these days. Thanks to Pat for patiently waiting for my paper as I was waiting to get into the archives. And thanks to the audience for your attention today.
Wonderful, and thank you, Corinna, for that fascinating history. We have an interesting question in the chat from Joanna Bork. She asks, have you found anything about the gendered aspects of providing food and cooking? I am thinking about discussions or training about the role of meat for male, quote, breadwinners, unquote, and the specific needs of female bodies.
That's a great question. And in my own research, which I certainly, I'm just starting this project really, so I intend to deepen this research. So far, I have not found any evidence of that. What I have found is consciousness of prices, consciousness for prices of food, different foods. So particularly in the recipes for like larger portions, recipes for kitchen, like hospital kitchens or nursery homes, all of these CAD catalogs have a little entry, a space for entry of like how much does a single portion cost. I have noticed that a lot of these recipe books and catalogs do not start with like dinner recipes. They start with baking recipes, interestingly, and then have larger sections for vegetable recipes, not surprisingly, and smaller sections for recipes that are based on meat or fish products that would have been more expensive. So I think this flows into the recipe collections, but more indirectly, and is certainly not like, I cannot at this point confirm any gendering of this thinking. I am wondering, though, in how far my lack of finding of this gendering might be an effect of different cultural contexts between the United States and Britain and other parts of the world.
Great, thank you so much, Corinna. And it was pointed out to me that we should probably clarify that in the United States, a public school is the equivalent of a state school in Britain. And so thank you, Patrick, for mentioning that. Thank you, Corinna, for a wonderful paper.